obviously there's an economic benefit to them if they don't have to buy fertiliser, and we know from the research as well that milk solids per cow tends to be higher on the clover swards because higher feed quality and you get higher intake. But like we've all the environmental benefits as well in terms of just removing that chemical fertiliser out of the system. There's benefits there in terms of emissions to be gained from having clover there. And this is something that any farmer who's good at managing grass, and has good soil fertility and so on, they can take advantage of clover in their system.
Hello, I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glenn.
Your Teagasc Sustainability Advisors. And you're welcome to the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast number 56, bringing you the latest information, science and opinion to improve farm sustainability. With lots of clover on farms this year, how can farmers get the benefit from this free nitrogen producing factory on their land?
Lecturer in Sustainable Agriculture, Dr. Deirdre Hennessy, University College Cork, joins us to discuss timing around reducing chemical nitrogen in clover swards. Deirdre, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you, Deirdre.
Clover research to date has demonstrated very promising results. Are farmers starting to trust the ability of this little plant?
They are, Deirdre, yeah. I suppose it's taken a little bit of time to trust. Farmers have, they've been reliant on chemical nitrogen fertiliser, and I suppose in a way it's been the safe bet in terms of nitrogen feeding their sward. But, we've a lot of very good research done by Teagasc in the last number of years and long-term studies. So the clover study in Moorpark is in its 11th year, and really we've had lots of farmers visiting that study, lots of advisors, been lots of information put out there. So they are starting to trust it. Some of them, they're going one or two paddocks and they're seeing how it gets on. And some of them are, taking a bigger jump or a greater leap of faith, and they're planting some more. But I suppose one important thing in helping farmers to gain that trust has been the on-farm clover study, which Michael Egan and Caitlin Looney are involved in, where their farmers are sowing clover on farms, are following I suppose a program of incorporation. But those results are being made available for people to see. And that combined with the clover walks that have been held in the spring of this year, 23, and last year, 22, where farmers can actually go and see the clover on the farm, and they can ask the other farmer, like the host farmer, questions. That's really helping farmers to gain some trust. And I suppose if we look back at open days, in the past number of years, the questions or the comments around the clover work would have been, yeah, that's nice, but my system works fine with fertiliser. I'm not going to change. But in 21, there was a different type of question coming. It was like, okay, I'm going to put in clover next year. Tell me what to do. Tell me how I do this. Or I've sown clover this year. How am I going to keep it now? When can I cut my nitrogen? How am I going to get the benefit of this clover? So I think there's a big shift in mindset for a lot of farmers around using clover, and it is certainly gaining their trust.
It's funny, isn't it? A few farmers I talk to, they always say it took until the fertiliser crisis to realise, geez, this is too good to be true. Like, it's just didn't believe it. Now they're looking back and saying, why didn't we do this for years?
Absolutely, Cathal. And look, the fertiliser crisis last year and the cost and supply issues certainly, I suppose, force the issue if you want. And I suppose the important thing now, though, is to keep that momentum going and that people don't slip back into the old ways, and that they continue to reap the benefits of the clover. Okay, obviously there's an economic benefit to them if they don't have to buy fertiliser. And we know from the research as well that milk solids per cow tends to be higher on the clover swards because higher feed quality and you get higher intake. But like we've all the environmental benefits as well in terms of just removing that chemical fertiliser out of the system. There's benefits there in terms of emissions to be gained from having clover there. And this is something that any farmer who's good at managing grass, and has good soil fertility and so on, they can take advantage of clover in their system. And they don't have to, you can crawl before you walk. You don't have to do the whole thing. It doesn't have to be like almost nuclear that you're gone from using nitrogen to using no nitrogen, can be stepwise, can be gradual, building up and gaining confidence in your own farm and its ability to work with clover.
I suppose they've backed it too with the Department of Ag writing it into, the derogation program as well.
Absolutely, Deirdre. And look, all these things help. I suppose, sometimes farmers feel stuff is forced on them, and to some extent it is. But I suppose the good thing about this is that we do have the research, and it's not, sometimes research only starts when something becomes an issue or it has to be implemented or whatever. But we have good solid database of research experiments over a good number of years. So like we don't have all the answers, but we have a lot of answers for farmers, and there's lots of information available for them through their advisors, and indeed going to farm walks and going to open days and so on. So, the derogation farmers have to sow clover now, but sure, look, if they're going to sow it, it would be great if they could get the real advantages of having it there.
And because so many derogations, and to me that was a masterstroke putting it into derogation, because you have to do it. But now all of a sudden, loads of farmers around the country and really intensive farmers and lots of other ones as well have lots of clover sowed on their farm. And you mentioned the importance of fertility. What are the other really important factors, I suppose, to maintain that clover in your sward?
Yeah, so like just on the fertility, Cathal, pH 6.3, 6.5, or even a bit higher is ideal for clover, and at least index 3 for P and K. But P and K are really important in terms of the clover plant, from establishment to nodule formation, which is where the action happens, if you like, where the nitrogen is converted to a usable form. And to the growth of the plant. So P and K are really important. And remember, okay, we have restrictions on P, but like K isn't, we've no restrictions on K. So if your soil needs K, feed your soil, because it'll be good for the grass component of the sward as well. Other things for clover are, there needs to be some space in the sward for clover. So old butty swards, for example, there would be difficult if you were going the oversowing route to get your clover in there. Then it likes nice weather, but some moisture, so sunshine and a bit of rainfall. But then to really take advantage of the clover, I suppose the other big thing to work on is your grassland management and your nitrogen fertiliser management. So you do need good grassland management. So the way clover and grass grow, you have the two in the sward together. But grass tends to take up any nitrogen that's available in the soil faster than clover can, so it grows faster. So if you have poor grassland management, and what I mean by that is swards aren't grazed out properly, so there's a lot of old material left, it's going to shade out the clover, or you have a very long grazing interval or rotation length, like, longer than 22 days, the grass is going to grow higher than the clover and it's going to shade it out. So you need a little bit of space in the paddock or in the field for the clover. And then the other thing to look at is the nitrogen fertilizer. So as I said, grass can take up nitrogen faster than clover can. So, if you're constantly feeding that grass, it'll grow faster. So you're risking shading out the clover. The other thing is, like, clover can actually use nitrogen that's supplied. So if it's using chemical nitrogen, you've good grazing management, you will keep the clover in the sward, but the ability or the level or the quantity of nitrogen that clover is fixing is going to decline. It's not going to bother fixing it if it has it for free. So you're not actually taking advantage of having clover in the sward. And then, Cathal, of course, generally, you need a reasonable amount of clover in your sward to actually take advantage of that. So generally, as clover content increases, your rate of fixation will increase. Similarly, as your chemical fertilizer application rate increases, your fixation will decrease. So they're kind of the factors that influence clover, but grazing management is very important once the clover is established.
And you mentioned pH there. So just wondering, we get some questions sometimes from our farmers in high molybdenum areas. So the advice there is to maintain your pH at 6 and no higher, because it can cause issues with the animals.
Yeah.
How is 6 okay for clover swards?
probably will struggle, Cathal, with the clover in that low pH. But then, I mean, you have to weigh it up because you don't want to have a negative impact on your animal as well in the high molybdenum area. So it might be a bit more challenging to get clover to establish and persist in those swards. But I suppose, there are challenges in all systems, and in the sward types that we saw in the systems. And I guess in that scenario, you have to put it in. Okay, if you have to sow it, you have to sow it. For example, if the farmers are in derogation, but I suppose be aware that it might struggle a bit to establish and persist long term in those soils.
It kind of puts farmers in high molybdenum areas off trying to establish it, doesn't it, really?
Well, I suppose it does, Deirdre, because sure, all the messaging is, you need good soil fertility, and pH being part of that. So yeah, look, it'll work in most, clover will grow in most soil types, but there will be soil types where it'll be a struggle to establish it and to get it to persist. So you have the high molybdenum soils, but also very peaty soils, because by their nature, they have low soil pH anyway. Again, it's going to be a challenge to get it to establish there. But in other parts of the country where you don't have those issues, farmers should try to get clover on their grazing ground and take advantage of it, because there's benefits for them, but then there's a wider benefits for the environment.
And it's great too that it can be established very, very cheaply too.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So it can be established as part of your normal reseeding program, or it can be stitched in or oversown.
Brilliant. This is a question that Cathal gave to me to give to you now, Deirdre.
You hung me out to dry now, Deirdre.
Yeah.
And in his words, does clover leaf size matter, Deirdre?
Yeah, so if we look at the old literature where the work would have been done on leaf size, and we haven't, I suppose, done a huge amount more recently on it, but we have Tomas Turbert is has started a new program looking at varieties and fixation and persistence and so on. But I suppose in terms of leaf size, I mean, if you think leaf size generally is kind of reflected in the contribution of the clover to the sward and the height it grows in the sward. So you have small, medium and large leaves. That's how leaf size, that's how clover is classified. So, small leaf clover tends to grow reasonably close to the ground. So, ideal for sheep type grazing scenarios where they can get down quite close to the ground in terms of grazing. Medium leaf then for cattle graze swards, because it can, it fixes its nitrogen and so on, but it will also contribute to what the cattle are grazing, because it's that bit further up in the sward. And then large leaf clover, I suppose, can be very dominating in the sward. I suppose any farmer who would have sown Arran back along, would say that it tended to dominate the sward, and I suppose maybe put farmers a bit off putting in clover, because it kind of took over in parts of fields and led to herbage deficits in the spring, and there wasn't enough there to feed the cows. So clover leaf size does matter, Deirdre. And I suppose we would say for dairy cow and cattle grazing to go medium leaf, and for sheep small leaf. But now there is one cultivar of white clover that's classified as small leaf, but it's closer to the medium leafed cultivars than to the other small leafed cultivars, and it's a Teagasc bred cultivar, Cool Fin. So some farmers are using that as well quite successfully in their cattle graze swards. So yeah, it is worth looking at the leaf size, Deirdre. I think there's probably a role for a bit more research though around the small leaf, and maybe that will have some role and does have some role in cattle grazed, that we might be able to take advantage of its fixation capacities, maybe in a mix with the medium leaf, which will, you'll have the fixation from that as well, but it's also contributing to what the cow or the cattle eat. So you can probably do a little bit of a mix, but again, we haven't really done any work on that. So so when I say we've a lot of research done, but we haven't the answers to everything, that's probably an area where there's room for a bit of research. But generally we'd say small leaf for sheep, medium leaf for cattle and cows, and large if you want to maybe go on silage ground.
So what's the difference then, Deirdre, between the red and the white clover varieties?
Yeah, so I suppose the big difference between the red and and the white clover is their growth habit. So white clover has a stoloniferous growth habit, which basically means it grows along the surface of the soil, and it has almost like runners, like strawberry plant runners running across the surface of the soil, and that at nodes along that it either sends down roots where the stolon will root, and then the next node probably send up a shoot, and you'll get a leaf and a flower if it's the summer. And it can grow continuously on that basis. If the stolon gets broken, once there's a root and a leaf either side of where it's broken, it can continue to grow. And once it's established, the white clover doesn't have a tap root. It relies on those adventitious roots that grow along the stolon. Red clover then has a different growth habit. It's much more upright. It has a tap root. It doesn't spread along the surface of the soil like the white clover does. Its growing point is also higher up on the plant, so it's about 4 or 5 centimeters above ground level, whereas the white clover, the growing point is at ground level. So that makes white clover more suitable to grazing type scenario. And that's why we end up a lot of the time seeing red clover for silage and white clover for grazing. And red clover, very good for silage production. Red clover silage crops need very little nitrogen, might need a little bit of nitrogen for the first cut, but that can be supplied through slurry. It doesn't have to be chemical nitrogen. And after that, it will essentially supply its own nitrogen. So I suppose they're the big differences, Deirdre, between red and white.
Is there a difference in longevity between the red and the white?
There tends to be, Deirdre, yeah. So if you're grazing red clover, for example, it doesn't last very long because that growing point is going to be grazed by livestock unless there's very lax grazing going on. But then you're going to be hitting herbage utilization, and I suppose on a farm you need to try and utilize as much of that low cost feed as possible. And then silage, of course, is hard on a sward anyway, and we would tend to have to reseed silage swards more frequently. But if you sow red clover with a good perennial ryegrass, and you could potentially sow some white clover in that mix as well. While the red clover might disappear out of your sward, you can continue to make silage from it if you have picked a suitable perennial ryegrass or cultivar to be the companion species in the sward. So, if it's silage ground and you're looking at the PPI, you need to pick cultivars that are good in terms of silage yield if it's dedicated silage ground. So there does tend to be some variation, all right, in longevity or persistence.
We're expecting clover to take off, I suppose, and now look, the weather's not ideal at the moment. It's fairly dry for the last couple of weeks, but in general, clover will be well taken off at this stage, Deirdre. But farmers at home, when they go out to the field, how do you know how much clover is in the sward? Now, I know you did a really good demonstration in Moore Park in the open day the last time we were down there, but how does the normal farmer know like what's in it? Because sometimes it can look like loads and there mightn't be loads in it.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Carl, because it is a little bit of a challenge to estimate. So I'd say the first thing to any farmer who's wondering, do they have good clover in their sward, is like walk their paddocks, walk their fields. And if the clover is widespread across the field or the paddock, they probably have a reasonably good establishment. It's if it's patchy, you'd be a bit worried about how much clover is going to be in the sward. And then, have a look and see what you estimate is there. And a rule of thumb, not 100% accurate, but, if it looks like the paddock is 100% clover, it's probably 50% clover. If it looks like it's 20%, it's probably 10%. So about half what it looks like. So remember, the clover leaf is much bigger. And it looks like it takes up much more space in the paddock than the grass, just by the growth habit of the plant. So you have the clover leaves, pointing up, and there's 3 little leaflets on each leaf. So it looks like it takes up more space than the more upright perennial ryegrass. So that's a guide, Cathal. And I think from looking at the work in Moore Park, somewhere around 15 to 20% white clover in April time, would suggest that there's good clover content in that field or that paddock, somewhere around that. And you're heading for a peak then of 35 to 45% in end of August, probably.
Yeah, and you've mentioned distribution twice, I'd say now, of clover in the conversation already today. So obviously it's vitally important. So if the grass in the sward is not beside abundant clover, it's not going to get the same amount of nitrogen as the ones beside the bunch, I presume.
Yeah, so I suppose the way clover works and how it feeds the grass plant is you get very little direct plant to plant transfer of nitrogen. So it's not like you have a clover plant here fixing nitrogen and the grass plant next to it is just like handing over the nitrogen to it. But what it does do is over time, the white clover contributes to the organic matter pool in the soil, and it does have a higher nitrogen content than the grass. So it's increasing that nitrogen in the soil. So if you're building your organic matter in the soil and you have grass plants there, then when nitrogen is released from the soil through that mineralization process, so when you have the organic nitrogen being converted to a plant usable form, like ammonium or nitrate, that the grass plant can use, if there's more of that available, there's more available for the grass plant to take up. So I suppose, that's kind of why, that's another difference, I suppose, Deirdre, between going back to the red clover and the white clover. Like when clover plants are fixing nitrogen, they're using that nitrogen for themselves initially, and then it's through decay of stolons and old leaf material and roots that they feed the grass plant. So the red clover plant grows more upright, and I suppose it fixes more nitrogen in the sense that it grows more itself. And it grows faster than white clover, whereas the white clover is a little bit slower to establish. But once that white clover is growing, it is fixing nitrogen, but it's only using that nitrogen for itself. It takes a little while to feed into that organic nitrogen pool and feed the grass part of the sward. So it's a little bit of a slower process.
There's something myself and Deirdre have come across a little bit where we walked into a field with a farmer and they said, geez, the clovers, after taking over the sward, I'm going to have to check it with spray. Is there ever a time where there's too much clover in a sward? Or is it just a visual that we're getting it wrong?
Yeah. So in Ireland, Cathal, we're very rare that we have too much clover in a sward, to be perfectly honest. And, if we were at that stage where farmers were worrying that they have too much clover in the sward, we'd be winning on the clover front. I would suggest to farmers who have that experience though and are worried, and maybe there will be some where they feel the clover is after taking over, and maybe it has, rather than going in with spray, a way of dealing with that is to allow a higher cover to build on the sward before you graze it, because that will, going back to what I was talking about earlier, that will check the clover growth. And it'll help to reduce the cover. Sometimes farmers worry in the autumn as well, Cathal, that they have too much clover and they'll have no grass the following spring. So there's a few management things they can do there. If they have paddocks that they think have a lot of clover in them, graze them later in the last rotation. Don't graze them in early October, because there's a big period of regrowth there before they're going to get to next February. If they can graze them at the start of November, they're going to take off all that clover cover, and they're going to allow the grass to tiller during the winter, because in general clover will kind of die back during the winter. So if you have a very dominant clover sward, in the middle of November, say, because it was closed at the start of October, all that clover is going to die back, but it's going to be a slow process over the winter, and it's going to take from the ability of the grass to tiller out. So like one management thing farmers can do if they're worried in the autumn is just graze those clover plots or paddocks off later in the last rotation. And I suppose the same follows true for new reseeds and oversown swards. Don't graze them at the start of the last rotation. Graze them kind of into the November period, and go back and graze them early again in the spring, to help the plant to tiller, but also to help with stolon production.
Deirdre, when can farmers start to cut back on their nitrogen if they've got a good cover of clover?
Yeah, that's a great question, Deirdre, because loads of people wonder about that. So I suppose let's just think for a minute about how clover grows firstly. So grass, we all know grass starts to grow around soil temperature of 5 degrees, somewhere around that. But actually clover doesn't start growing until about soil temperature of 8 degrees. So that's why in the spring, we often might walk into a clover paddock and go, God, there's no clover here, or there's only a small bit of clover, because it tends to be low down in the sward. It's not actively growing. The temperatures aren't high enough. But, for farmers who need feed for their cows in that spring period, February, March, April, they need to feed the grass component of the sward in particular. So you're probably going to go to your normal fertiliser February, March, April. But then once the temperatures are rising and clover starts to kick off in the sward, nitrogen can be cut back. So we would generally say, Deirdre, from about May onwards, and cut back nitrogen. So the research we've done has been looking at 150, and there's some work going on now looking at 100, both in Moorpark and Clonakilty, and even lower if you look at the stuff that's been done in Salahead. So it's from May onwards when clover starts to really make a contribution to the sward. But the other thing that's happening from May onwards is, remember we were talking a while ago about building that organic nitrogen pool in the soil. That's also the time when the bacteria that are releasing that nitrogen for plant use, they're really starting to kick off as well in terms of working. Soil temperature is increasing. They like warm temperatures. There's good photosynthesis for energy production for both the grass and the clover plants, and the soils still tend to be moist, as in there's still rainfall, so there's no soil moisture deficit, so that the mineralizing bacteria are going to be working on releasing the nitrogen. So you're really taking advantage then of the clover's fixing nitrogen. It's using that to grow its component of the sward, but then you have the organic matter being converted into plant usable nitrogen for the grass. So from May onwards, Deirdre, is the ideal time. And I mean that the nitrogen application can be halved. There's a variety of ways of dealing with it. Nitrogen can be put out every second rotation, or if a farmer is confident, they might choose to skip a few rounds of nitrogen. For maybe you might skip nitrogen for the month of July, or half of August or something like that. But that's when you can save 120 kilos of nitrogen in terms of application, is during that May to August period.
Brilliant.
And a lot of farmers are grass measuring now anyway, so if they see something, they can react on you if there's something going on.
Absolutely, Cathal. And I mean, I suppose the beauty of grass measuring is every week or twice a week you're seeing what's happening on the farm. And even on grass only farms where there is no clover, we do need to bring some bit more precision into our fertiliser management, and we do have to cut fertiliser use anyway. So measuring grass and knowing what's on your farm, looking at forecast, looking at the grass growth prediction that's done in Moorpark every week, you can build a picture of what's happening on your farm, and then you can use that information to make really good decisions around fertiliser use. And look, a simple thing is if a farmer every rotation has to skip paddocks because there's too much and they have to go and bale that grass, that surplus, there's too much nitrogen in the system because they're growing more than they need. So look, there is space to pull back on fertilizer, and I suppose again some of that is confidence, Cathal, in yourself in making that decision. But if you can use as much information as is available, you can be confident. And I suppose the other thing about grass measuring is farmers who've been doing it for a number of years, they build up really good knowledge on how their different paddocks react to different kind of weather scenarios and grazing scenarios and even fertilizer scenarios. And they know the paddocks that, if I cut back the fertilizer on this one by 20% or 50%, this paddock is still going to grow okay. I've good amount of clover in it, or, this part of the farm grows better when the weather is good than this part, and it's probably because there's more active bacteria in the soil for mineralization or something like that. But grass measurement, I know it takes a little bit of time and it's a bit of practice and all that, but it gives such a wealth of information to the farmer that I think it's totally undervalued. It's an important component of any farm business. As we often hear this, you can't manage what you don't measure, but that's absolutely true. We measure so many other components of our businesses. Why not measure grass as well?
Deirdre, thanks a million for your time. Really enjoyed the chat, and I know you started a new position as lecturer in sustainable agriculture in UCC lately, so I wish you the very best luck in your new role, and thanks a million for joining us on the show.
Thanks very much, Cathal. Thanks, Deirdre.
That's it for this episode of the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast. thanks to Dr. Deirdre Hennessy, lecturer in Sustainable Agriculture in University College Cork, for joining us on the show.
Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glenn.
Join us next time for the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, signpost to farm sustainability.